Peter Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Immanuel Kant. This is episode 7 of a marathon read through the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophers, sort of a deeper look at philosophers, and as I read through them you can see how they're linked. There are other ones which you say, look, I don't understand, and you say, well, next time I'll target that person. Definitely Kant is sort of the greatest post-Enlightenment philosopher who sort of responded to the empiricism of the Enlightenment with rationalism, and basically he is suffering these shocks of, it's interesting that religion is developed, but then thinking people realise the shock of science and work from the premise, a religious premise, that God exists, and tries to reason what that means in science. So really it's a sort of like a scholasticism, the medieval way of saying both science and God are correct, let's see what we can explore about our inner knowledge. And it's quite interesting because this is set off quite legitimate areas, even though the origin may be questionable, legitimate areas of human study, where he's looked at how you perceive things, and the most last episode was on self-consciousness. Now this is episode 7, 4.2, objectivity and judgment. So how are we self-conscious? And of course nowadays we've got a whole lot of computers and simulations and a whole lot more data to answer that rather than a philosophical answer, and that basically gets to the heart of it, in terms of it's not unreasonable that these people have a go at thinking it. How can they deduce it? And the thing is that they come up with unusual things that ahead of their time, and sort of the empiricism floods into it. So it's ahead of the time. We've developed mind and matter, which has gone into our culture from Descartes. This entire movement of self-consciousness, or the consciousness as associated with the soul, has gone up into psychology. Basically, this is almost the basis of psychology. So although it's had an unusual tilt, it's actually broadened the advance of science in my overall humble view. So now let's read this. 4.2, objectivity and judgment. On the basis of this formal idealist conception of self-consciousness, Kant's argument, at least one central thread of it, moves through two more conditions of self-consciousness in order to establish the objective validity of the categories. Okay, now he came up somehow that you have to have a parallel process on all categories of knowledge. Look, this is hard to do, and this parallel processing is part of consciousness, which corresponds a little bit to the new neurology that your consciousness synthesizes inputs from different parts of your brain for consciousness. It really coincides with a modern anesthesiology, a modern understanding of consciousness. And this is where it really goes. The pre-thought sort of sets out the sort of outline for which science goes into. The next condition is that this self-consciousness requires me to represent an objective world distinct from my subjective representations, that is, distinct from my thoughts about the sensations of my objective world. Kant uses this connection between self-consciousness and objectivity to insert the categories into his arguments. Okay. And remember, this is transcendental deduction, that is, what can you work out from just your thought alone, which I suppose is basically what we would call mathematics. In order to be self-conscious, I cannot be wholly absorbed in the contents of my perceptions, but must distinguish myself from the rest of the world. Good point. But if self-consciousness is an achievement of the mind, then how does the mind achieve this sense that there is distinction between I that perceives and the contents of its perceptions? So Descartes was a bit earlier, myself and matter. Now it's saying, well, I've got to see myself as a player in the world, and we sort of have an answer to that now called sympathetic neurons, that we have ourselves we model ourselves in the world, and we actually model others in the world. According to Kant, the mind achieves this by distinguishing representations that necessarily belong together from representations that are not necessarily connected but merely associated in a contingent way. Consider Kant's example of the perception of a house. Imagine the house is too large to fit any of your visual field from your vantage point near its front door. Now imagine you walk around the house, successively perceiving each of the sides. Eventually you perceive the entire house, but not all at once, and you judge that each of your representations of the sides of the house necessarily belong together as sides of one house, and that one who is denied this would be mistaken. But now imagine that you grew up in the house and associated a feeling of nostalgia with it. Would you not judge that representation of the house are necessarily connected to the feelings of nostalgia? That is, your mind would not think that other people seeing the house for the first time would be mistaken if they denied that it is connected with nostalgia, because you recognize that this house is connected with nostalgia for you, but not necessarily for everyone. Okay, which is Piaget's theory of mind, which is something that we would test this psychologically and actually test this thing switch on. Yet you distinguish this merely subjective connection from the sides of the house necessarily belong together in the object, because the connection holds for everyone universally, and because it is possible to be mistaken about it. The point there is not that we must successfully identify which representation necessarily belongs together and which are merely associated contingently, but rather to be self-conscious we must at least be able to make this general distinction between the objective and the merely subjective connections of the representation. So so in modern psychology, which has come up, we actually test the switching on of this attribute, whereas Kant, without the knowledge of this switching on, would have said, well, this is an innate thing that even children have, but children don't actually have this knowledge. So they would assume that everyone would also share their opinion of nostalgia. It's a while before people learn that people think differently. At this point, at least in the second edition text, Kant introduces the key claim that judgment is what enables us to distinguish objective connections of representations that necessarily belong together and merely subjective contingent associations. A judgment is nothing other than a way to bring given cognitions to the objective unity of a perception. This is a funny word, so it's not perception, apperception, so I'll have to really understand what that is, rather than just in the context. That's what I think a lot of people do. They just learn a word for the context and that's enough. They want to move on, but I'll learn it. This is the aim of the copula, is in them. This is the aim of the copula is in them, to distinguish the objective unity of given representations from the subjective. The word for designates the relationship of representations to the original apperception and its necessary unity. Gosh, that's really hard. Kant is speaking here about the mental act of judging that results from the formation of a judgment. Judging is an act of what Kant calls synthesis, from which he defines as, quote, the action of putting different representations together with each other and comprehending their manifoldness in one cognition. Okay, I think neuroscientists would also agree with that nowadays. End quote. In other words, to synthesize is general to combine several representations into a single, more complex representation, and judge is to combine concepts into the judgment. That is, to join a subject concept and to predicate the concept by means of copula, whatever that is, as in the body is heavy or the house is four-sided. Judgments need not to be true, of course, but they always have a truth value, true or false, because they make claims about objective validity. That's interesting. When I say, by contrast, that, quote, if I carry a body, I feel the pressure of weight, unquote, or if I see the house, I feel nostalgia, I'm not making a judgment about the object or the body or the house, but I'm rather expressing a subjective association that may apply only to me. So he's really laboured through, and so this is probably the extent in terms of his rational thought is moved way ahead of he's talking as someone who's got a pet machine and thousands of data points, all MRIs, machines are beginning to work this out now. He's actually worked it out centuries ahead using his thought mechanisms, which is sort of proof of what he's trying to do. So I find it interesting that Kant is his own evidence of the value of himself. All he really needed to say is, I am Kant, but that's my view, which is strange because that actually links back into what he was just saying. I subjectively assess Kant. He's saying you're subjective. I'm making a statement which can't be true or false, and so I make a statement which is true or cannot be true or false. I feel that Kant could have just said, I am simply Kant, and that would have been sufficient proof of Kant. Kant could have been proof of Kant. There you go. Kant's reference to the necessary unity of apperception or self-consciousness in quotations above means, at least, that the action of judging is a way our mind achieves self-consciousness. We must represent the objective world in order to distinguish ourselves from it. We represent an objective world by judging that some representations necessarily belong together. Moreover, recall from 4.1, which I don't know what that is, which is self-consciousness, that we must have a priori capacity to represent the world as a law governed because, quote, we can represent nothing as combined or connected in the object without having previously combined ourselves, which is true. That's why that's the act of learning. So you learn sort of with counters, and then you learn with trucks, then you learn with food serves. It sort of goes on. The concept goes ahead. It follows that objective connections in the world cannot simply imprint themselves into our mind. Rather, experience of an objective world must be constructed by exercising a priori capacity to judge, which Kant calls the faculty of understanding, which is we call learning. The understanding constructs experience by providing the a priori rules or framework for necessary laws in accordance with which we judge representations to be objective. These rules are pure concepts of understanding or categories, which are therefore conditions of self-consciousness, since they as rules for judging about the objective world, and the self-consciousness requires that we distinguish ourselves from the objective world. Now this is pretty interesting, and you must understand at this stage that this is Kant's view of consciousness is different from our view of consciousness. So you got hundreds of years later, or about less than 100 years later. What is he? 1806 he parks. You got Freud and the Jung and the self-consciousness and the social consciousness. So this idea of consciousness is actually picked up by the European people and is injected directly into psychology. So this obviously doesn't address the subconsciousness because this has not come here. So there's no concept of subconsciousness. Kant identifies the categories in what he calls a metaphysical deduction, in which precedes transcendental deduction. Oh my God, let me read that one again. Kant identifies the categories in what he calls metaphysical deduction, which precedes transcendental deduction. Very briefly, since the categories are a priori rules for judging, Kant argues that an exhaustive table of categories can be derived from a table of basic logical forms of judgments. For example, according to Kant, the logical form of a judgment that quote, the body is heavy, unquote, would be a singular affirmative categorial and esoteric. But since categories are not mere logical functions but instead are rules for making judgments about objects of the objective world, Kant arrives at a table of categories by considering how each logical function would structure judgment about objects within our spatio-temporal forms of intuition, which is sort of very interesting because quantum mechanics and string theory actually go beyond our physical understanding. Like, electrons are exquisitely S2 symmetry, but aside from Mobius strips, we have got really nothing in our experience which is S2 symmetry. So this there goes into a bit of the problems with us understanding quantum mechanics, and that's why I'm sort of people don't understand. It's because they don't understand how they don't understand. But okay, for example, he claims that categorical judgments express a logical relation between subject and predicate that correspondences to the ontological relation between the substance and accident, and the logical form of the hypothetical judgment expressed a relation that corresponds to the cause and effect. Taken together with this argument, then, the transcendental deduction argues that we become self-conscious by representing an objective world of substances that interact according to causal laws. Now, again, I would say Kant is self-conscious. Most of us don't, or most people don't actually. This would be an ideal world. I mean, an ideal boring world where everyone would never do anything wrong, because they have to work out that they're doing something wrong. They have to be, basically, to do something wrong, you have to be a little bit stupid somewhere. That's my opinion. I'm not going up too ahead. We're at 15 minutes, and let's go for 4.3. The lawgiver of nature. The final condition of self-consciousness that Kant adds to the preceding conditions is that our understanding must cooperate with the sensibility to construct one unbounded and unified space-time, to which all our representations may be related. It sort of says this is like Newton having a plug at space-time. To see why this further condition is required, to consider that so far we have seen why Kant holds that we must represent an objective world in order to be self-conscious. But we could represent an objective world even if it were not possible to relate all our representations to the objective world. For all that has been said so far, we might still have unruly representations that cannot relate in any way to the objective framework of our experience. Look, I would also agree, like this, say people are quite abused. There's people are trying to make sense of a world, and people are just not playing fairly, and they get abused. And so I just think socially this is an interesting thing. On Kant's view, this would be a problem because, as we have seen, he holds that self-consciousness involves universality and necessity, according to his principles of apperception. Quote, I think we must be able to accompany all my representations, unquote. Yet, if on the one hand I had representations that could not relate in some way to the objective world, then I could not accompany those representations with, quote, I think, or recognize them as representations, because I can say I think about any given representation only by relating it to an objective world according to the argument just discussed. So I must be able to relate any given representation to an objective world in order it to count as mine. Okay, my own representation. Okay. On the other hand, self-consciousness would also be impossible if I represent multiple objective worlds, even if I could relate all my representations to some objective world or other. In that case, I could not become conscious of an identical self, that is, say, representation 1 in space-time, A representation 2 in space-time, B. God. Which is really, really interesting, I think, because if you read Einstein's critique of his own thinking, he could actually hold different conceptualizations and actually play them off against it in his head. He said he allowed to rain down possibilities and let the sun willow out the correct possibilities. So Einstein could be actually multiply self-conscious. I believe that's true. And when you come to think of it, his project planning that he went to the Manhattan Project created a multi-consciousness of the US. So he used multiple corporations competing there in building the atomic bomb. That's just my opinion on it. It may be possible to imagine disjointed space-times, but not possible to represent them as objectively real. So self-consciousness requires that I can relate all my representations to a single objective world. Well, if you're lucky, yeah. The reason why I must represent this one objective world by means of a unified unbounded space-time is that, as Kant argued in the Transcendental Aesthetic, oh my godfather, space and time are pure forms of human intuition. If we had different forms of intuition, then our experience would still have to constitute a unified whole in order for us to be self-conscious. By this would not require a spatio-temporal whole. Given that the space-time are forms of intuition, however, our understanding must still cooperate with the sensibility to construct a spatio-temporal whole experience, because, once again, quote, we represent nothing as combined in an object without having previously combined it ourselves, end quote, and, quote, all combinations is an action of understanding, end quote. So Kant distinguishes between space-time and purer forms of intuition, which belong solely to sensibility, and the formal intuitions of space-time or space-time to that's a bit rich. Which are unified by understanding. These formal intuitions are spatio-temporal whole with which our understanding constructs experience in accordance to these categories. Yeah, I think this is actually quite interesting because you very rarely get a physicist who knows general relativities and quantum mechanics just reading through this and knowing how it played out. The most important implication of Kant's claim that understanding constructs a single whole experience to which all our representations can be related is that, since he defines nature as, quote, regarded materially and, quote, the sum total of all appearances, end quote, and has argued that the categories are objectively valid for all possible appearances, on his view, it follows that our categories are the source of fundamental laws of nature regarded formally, which is true. I think that's really interesting in terms of Einstein's had his two postulates that the laws of physics are the same in all reference frames. It's sort of like you can see Kantian coming through that way, and the speed of light is constant in all. So his application of two postulates is actually extension of the Kant theory. So, Kant concludes on the basis that the understanding is the true lawgiver of nature. In his words, all appearances in nature, as far as the combination is concerned, stand under the general categories on which nature, considered merely as nature in general, depends as the original ground of necessarily lawfulness, as the nature is regarded formally. Or, more strongly, quote, we ourselves bring into the appearance that order regularly that we call nature, and moreover we could not be able to find it were there if we, or nature of our mind, had not originally put it there. Understanding is thus not merely a faculty of making rules through comparison of appearances, it is itself the legislation of nature. Without understanding, there would not be any nature at all. Well, that's quite amazing. I love that term. Understanding is the legislation of nature. Is that not a beautiful term? So at 22 minutes, I come to the end of episode 7. Thanks for listening. That was actually quite interesting, for me at least. Thanks for listening. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.